Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Vice President, members of Congress, and my fellow Americans. Now, the United States Constitution states that every now and then, a president has to inform Congress about the state of this union. And not since Carter has a president written to Congress. Despite my attempts to avoid this. You see, this is the president, as you see before you. A shallow attempt at satire, a joke of parody, and an insult not only to your intelligence, but the purpose of politics as it is. As president, I was consulted with lies, conspiracy, and the roughhousing we've seen in the previous decade of politics through verbal spats or 24-hour news cycles, hungry for content. My cabinet is overburdened with morons far in excess of their means. People you'd find ranting at the end of dive bars about how they'd fix politics, but would never know the first thing about international trade agreements or be able to spell the word diplomacy. I put a man into space with lies. I killed my gay ex-lover. And I was convinced into passing the 28th Amendment to halt legal proceedings into my actions once I leave office. It was a sandcastle built on damp foundations, a concept you could find in a mildly interesting political thriller. But it never amounted to more than laughable reflections of what got us into this mess in the first place. My predecessor was only but a few shades off of orange from being the 45th president, in all but name. My vice president, a former head of the FBI and self-described conspiracy nut, was a complete idiot concerned with the deep state and the establishment. Leaks came from local DC fortune tellers. I bought myself the right-wing press while in office, and impeachment proceedings began with my approval rating at some of the highest among the previous 10 presidents. The story of my presidency was one I had little to no action in, for the narrative crafted for me was to react, not lead the country. No threat assessments, no daily briefings, despite the former administration holding them on national security concerns in the transition period. And I didn't see them after my inauguration either. The Secret Service was mostly a secret for me not to know, as they came and went throughout my time as they pleased. Not protecting, but held as a group of men in black seeking to take me down. Press briefings and presidential speeches never came as frequently as you'd expect, but bland and poorly written tweets did. G7, G20, climate summits, and other foreign trips were not a thing for my first year. The puppeteers of my presidency, as it were, had nothing but apathy for what they were doing, taking the previous decade of hatred against one another, the anger, the resentment, and placating it with superficial endeavours to seem bipartisan with childish views on the subject, and even more childish understandings of satirism. The first school shooting of my presidency, something many presidents have had to tackle, as the gun lobby is such a big thing in America, was handled not with deftness, but with ham-fisted parody. My FBI director telling me the lefty media and their concern for the children was the biggest consideration, not the profound consequence of what the president has to deal with in those moments, or a hostage situation that was beyond ridiculous. It was no longer laughably inadequate. It was tragically idiotic. Yet somewhere, deep down, there was a glint of decision-making, a spark of doing good and having to make problematic decisions that weren't tarnished by conspiracy. Concerns that mattered and made life better for some, short-term stories that told the truth and tragedy of some of the people we call our neighbours and friends. When people fled South America and were met with hatred and death at the border, that had an impact. When stories were allowed to live without the concern over this 28th Amendment, when I wasn't concerned about the DC fortune tellers leaking White House details and possible Yankee White clearance information when I wasn't bothered by my wife's voodoo nonsense at Naval Support Facility Thermont. I could get to the leading portion of the job. Instead, I was concerned about money laundering, not through a car wash in New Mexico, but my own presidential charity. If I were allowed to take more bilateral meetings, concentrating my focus on what I swore to do, by faithfully executing the powers of the office of the president, and not executing what was apparently my plan as I bumble around not knowing a damn thing about it. Setting out policy and putting together a country that is seemingly supposed to be fractured right down the middle, but instead is happy to cheer me on as I operate with people who didn't pass middle school Spanish. If I asked this lot ¿Dónde está biblioteca?, I'd get a blank expression. So when Cocaine turned up with a note reading Con amor desde Mexico a amigos de la Casa Blanca, no one in the highest office in the land knew what it meant. This is the president that was trusted by 90% of the country, according to the polls. The president that was consulted by the worst people, was fed and digested a number of lies, and was hardly ever handed the power of the Oval Office in the first place. If I was supposed to be Truman Burbank in this situation, I was the leader in the worst conception of political satire, neither clever nor witty enough to understand political satirism, beyond the contemporary late-night hosts with their fake laughs, stale smiles, and stagnant material that you could pick up from the floor of an amateur Midwestern open mic night. It was not a comedy, it was a tragedy of potential being squandered for the sake of a cheap joke, repeated from time to time without the knowledge that it was exhausted already. With that said, I hereby formally resign the powers of the Oval Office and have taken the necessary action to suggest my co-conspirators are removed too. Peace out, bitches.